Welcome to our Latina Lens podcast. Our mission is to elevate the voices and the work of Latina and Latina photographers. My name is Monica, and I have been interested in photography since my parents gave me my first 110 millimeter Mickey Mouse camera. It was magenta. I loved it and have had a camera ever since. I studied photojournalism for a while. I've gone to art school and taken photography classes. I was an art teacher for 10 years. And when I had a life-saving organ transplant 5 years ago, one of the things you ask yourself after an experience like that is, what do I want to do with my life? What haven't I done? And for me, returning to photography in a serious way was one of the things that I knew would be part of my bonus time, as I call it. So I dove into photography. I returned to learning and training. And during the pandemic, when we all had to pause, one of the questions I realized I couldn't answer was, who's my favorite Latina photographer? And if you know me, you know it's strange that I wouldn't have an answer to that question. So from there, I began seeking out Latina photographers and have found over 300 actively working Latina photographers, historical figures. And in seeking out a community of Latina photographers, I didn't find one that was quite right for the level at which I was at. That was inclusive of all kinds of genres, that really welcome folks at any level of photography. So being who I am and my life history, and anyone who knows me knows when I don't find something that I need, I create it. So that was the birth of our Latina Lens community. Learning of the stories, learning about different Latina photographers also led me to creating this podcast, because it wasn't enough just for me to find the stories. I wanted to share the stories with others. So this is our very first episode. I thought it was important to start with the person who literally wrote the book on Latinx photography in the United States, the first of its kind survey of photographers of Latin American heritage who have created work in the United States. Elizabeth Ferrer is an author and a curator. She is currently the chief curator of contemporary art at Brick in Brooklyn, New York. I wanted to begin with a conversation about what we know about how Latina and Latina photographers have contributed to the visual history of this country. As you will hear in this conversation, there's so much more to uncover through future research, and there's so much more known than all but Elizabeth's work would imply about how Latino or Latina photographers have contributed to American art history. In addition to encouraging you to buy Elizabeth's book if you haven't already, I have listed the many photographers she introduces in this episode in our show notes. And when possible, I included links to those photographers. The show notes are linked in your podcast player and are also available on our website, ourlatinalens.com. Future episodes will be interviews with photographers, alternating with episodes that take a deep dive into those photographers' significant images. I am so excited to share these with you, and I'm so excited to have this podcast playing for you right now. If you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletter at our website, again, ourlatinalens.com, and welcome to the community. Hello, Elizabeth. It's such an honor to have you here and to talk about the work that you've done, the research you've done. It was so exciting to find the work that you had done online. Even before your book had published, you had some links, some photographers online. That was such a privilege to be able to follow. Welcome. Thank you for being on our Latina Lens podcast.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here.
You are an accomplished curator. Tell me a little bit about that journey and how you came to have an interest in photography.
Sure. Well, I actually got my interest in photography when I was in high school. I had a 35 millimeter camera. I just started taking pictures. I grew up in Los Angeles, around town, and I just had a passion for it. But I think I knew early on that that wasn't going to be my career. I studied it and I practiced it. But when I discovered kind of the greater world of museums and writing and curating, that made more sense to me. And so I pursued a degree in art history. I studied the history of photography. When I finished school, I came to New York. I began to curate on a freelance basis and eventually got a position with an institution. And I began to really gravitate towards Mexican art. I'm Mexican American. I realized I didn't know much about that field. So I started going down to Mexico. And I was very lucky to meet a lot of artists, a lot of gallerists, people who helped me to put together exhibitions. And for a good while in the 1990s, I was curating on a freelance basis exhibitions of Mexican art and photography that would travel in the United States, which I loved. It was a lot of fun. I, was able to work with some amazing artists and photographers, but at a certain point, I realized that I knew less about artists and photographers closer to home. I was living in New York. There is a big Latinx art scene here. At that point, these artists were not getting much attention, certainly not the photographers. I began to do some work with Enfoco, which is a photographers collective that was founded by a group of Puerto Rican photographers in the 1970s. I mean, we're in the 90s. I was not there at the beginning, but they were active with shows, a magazine, with a competition for new works. Especially through Enfoco in the beginning, I began to get integrated into this world of Latinx photographers. And then I did some work with PhotoFest that did one of the first exhibitions, probably the first exhibition of Latinx photographers in the mid 1990s. And from there, I just realized that, this is the field that I wanted to really be dedicated to. This was the field that just did not receive any attention. There really had been no museum exhibitions, certainly no books. These photographers were not being taught in history of photography classes. And while it took me a good while, I also have a full time job as a curator. I decided that I would write this book on Latinx photography. It's been a slow process, but a very steady process of getting myself more and more integrated into this world and also learning the history. As you know, my book goes all the way back to the 1850s. And, I see the book as a beginning. I've learned a lot through the whole process, but there is certainly a lot more to uncover, a lot more photographers that, should have monographic works dedicated to their body of photography.
I know one of my first messages to you once I'd read your book was so much gratitude. In my history of photography class in art school, I told you that I'd kind of had a heated discussion with my history of photography teacher saying, "Are you telling me no people of color have ever picked up a camera? Like, that's what you're telling me through how we're learning and who we're learning about." So I'm super excited that there's this resource now and that you've created the ability for us to like give this book to our, our professors and say,
Yes.
if you don't know about them, here they are. Thank you so much for that work. And I love that you started in with the daguerreotypes, right? I love that you started with artists who, even in your book, says there's not much known about them, but here they are. Here are the names that I found. Here where their studios might have been, or knowing where they are. And especially one of our first Our Latina Lens meetups, we talked about Fanny. Can you talk a little bit about her and what you found about her?
That was a wonderful find. So, as I think I spend a little bit of time in the book talking about the 19th century and the early 20th century. The book really begins in earnest with the late 1960s and the civil rights movement. But I wanted to dig and see who was out there. I did find some really important pioneering figures who were born in the early decades of the 20th century, and I have profiles of them. They're all men. But astoundingly, the very, very first photographer in the book is Epifania de Guadalupe Vallejo, known as Fanny Vallejo. Her father was the Mexican governor of Alta California. This was when California was still part of Mexico. This means that Fanny came from a very privileged background. Her father wrote a history of California. He had a large library. She had tutors. She learned music. And she also got a hold of a daguerreotype camera when she was an adolescent. And it is believed that she made either some of the first or the first daguerreotypes in the state. And the fact that we don't know her is a real omission. And I don't claim that she's a photographer with a large body of work or that she's a great photographer, but she was the first. And for me, she represents these lacks of knowledge that we still have about the history of photography. Fanny is known only to a few specialists. I found her in a very specialized encyclopedia of photographers in the West. And I think there's one article that's been written about her. There's scant information about her. But I think there is more information. I was writing about something like 80 photographers that I profiled in the book. So I couldn't do a doctoral thesis type research on each one. But I would love to delve into more into that history and see what else is out there. Some of these early photographs were made in photo studios or by itinerant photographers. Some of the work still exists in historical societies. A lot of it was created anonymously. A lot of it, I'm sure, still is lost. As I mentioned, there's a great deal of research that can be done, and I think there are more discoveries to be had as more researchers take up the mantle of studying this, what I call a parallel history of American photography.
Yes, to me, she is so symbolic of this idea that there is a history and a presence in the entirety of the United States history. It's just not documented, and therefore we don't know about it. And for me, there's so much energy when you think you're the first at doing something, and that like pressure is almost taken off when you're like, nope, there's been people doing this for a really long time. We just need to seek them out. We need to find them, and you can grow off of what they've accomplished. You don't have to take on that mantle of I'm the first Latina to do whatever, right? So it's really exciting that you're uncovering this history and that hopefully you and others will continue to expand our knowledge of people like Fanny and all the photographers that you profile in this book.
Yeah, exactly. There are pioneers and mentors and heroes, and we need to rest on their shoulders.
Definitely. And I also really enjoyed how thorough your introduction when you talked about the term Latinx, because we are a conglomerate of communities that have differences, similarities. How we label ourselves or call ourselves or group ourselves can often be I don't want to say contentious, but sometimes it's contentious, or people identify in one way or another. And those of us who, like for me, having to decide how to call this community in this podcast, or for you, how to title your book, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your thought process and why you chose the term Latinx.
That's a good question, and I guess I have kind of a complicated answer. First of all, I spent years writing the book, so when I started, the word Latinx didn't appear in my text because that term was not in common usage yet. So, over time, that term was adopted, and I began to think about how I would use it in the context of this book, where I am dealing with Chicanx photographers in the Southwest, from California to Texas, and also in other parts of the United States now. Puerto Rican photographers in Puerto Rico and in the Northeast, Cuban Americans, and then various photographers that live in different parts of the country. Some live in other cities because they have academic positions. And our populations have gravitated throughout the United States. So the book is very much national in scope. And while it does focus on the three largest ethnic groups, so Mexican American, Puerto Rican, and Cuban American, there are photographers in the book whose families come from Guatemala, from Panama, from other countries. So, in a way, Latinx was a good clarifying structure to think about the fact that we're all very different. We all have our different histories, our different challenges, and yet we are united by language, by the commonality of a colonial history, in many cases by Catholicism, and by the fact that our populations have been marginalized. So we all have these shared experiences as well as our own specific experiences with it. Even Chicanos, say in San Francisco and LA, I find very different, and then in San Antonio are different yet again. So we are very diverse. I think we celebrate that. But in embracing the term Latinx, I do want to point out that we do have these commonalities and that I feel that we're stronger by being unified, by thinking of ourselves as a people that come from the Americas, that are in the United States, that have affected the culture, the economy of the United States. We're a fairly large percentage of this country now, something like 18%. So for me, using the term Latinx was a term of empowerment and a term of a collective voice, through this diversity.
And I love thinking about like what as artists and creatives gives us joy. What did you find exciting or joyful in your research of photographers? Who are you extra excited about? I'm sure, you had to choose amongst many, many, and you narrowed it down, it sounds like, to 80. But who stands out or who would you like to share with first? Because I'm sure we'll talk about lots of photographers.
Over time, one of the photographers that just meant more and more and more to me was Laura Aguilar. I had been following her work probably since the early 90s. And, she was a groundbreaking, risk-taking photographer from the beginning, as a marginalized on, in many ways. She was, first of all, a woman. She was a lesbian. She was a large woman. She had problems with communication, with verbal communication. So she had just about every impediment you could put in front of a person. And yet she created this body of work that just speaks so powerfully to people. And I was reminded again, visiting the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art recently, where just a couple of her works were on view, but in relation to other photographers dealing with the body and nature. And I think that her work can speak to people in many different ways, in that she was dealing with her lesbian identity, her Chicana identity. She was thinking about the body and the environment. She is somebody who had an exhibition a few years ago at the Vincent Price Museum in LA. That was the first large retrospective of her work, and that traveled to several cities in the United States. And this was during the time of COVID, and I participated in a number of the Zoom conversations that took place. And I was so struck by how people everywhere were discovering her work and finding meaning in her work. And although she has gotten a lot of exposure recently, especially since her passing just a few years ago, I find that there are still layers of work, layers of meaning to be discovered, and that her work has, power for even younger generations. So I think she's one.
Her work is incredibly powerful. I love her work and watching her. I follow her, I guess it'd be as her estate or her loved ones who are also kind of announcing every time there's an acquisition. It's just so exciting to see her work being collected or acquired by different institutions that more and more people will see her really powerful work.
It's exciting, but it's also sort of sad that a lot of this happened after she passed, right?
Yes.
The SF BOMA has her work now, the Getty Museum, I think the Whitney, which is wonderful. It's great. And she began to see that recognition, right before she passed. She was able to attend her opening at the Vincent Price Museum. But this is what happens often with women photographers or women artists in general. And since I've written the book, a few of these artists, men and women, have passed. And so as you say, it's time to document these histories and to learn about these legacies. I would say another photographer that's really interesting to me, maybe a little under the radar still, but fairly well known in New York, is Karen Miranda Rivadeneira. That's how she goes by in my book. She now has taken the name Koyo, which is an indigenous name. She's had a few different bodies of work. The body of work in my book is a series of staged photographs that she made with her family, reenacting kind of commonplace scenes, but things in her life that had importance later on. So she reenacts herself as a child, her mother as a younger mother, other siblings take part in the work, and they're very moving. There's something very poignant about seeing these incidents in her life being replayed, you know, at a point in her life when she has more knowledge and more experience. She's gone on to make some very different bodies of work. In her native Ecuador, she's worked with shamans and has created works that include both indigenous people, photographs of indigenous people, and painting. And more recently, she's worked in the land, creating both photographs and videos. And I find that her work continues to react to the moment in time, very much true to her own self and to a journey of personal discovery that she's going through, but at the same time, feeling very relevant in the moment, very beautiful, very healing. And so I would recommend your listeners to look up her work.
I've showed you before that my book is all marked up with all my sticky notes and kind of going through and continue every time I, reach for it, I learn something new or I'm reminded of an incredible artist. And you've spoken to this too. So my first thing was to count, because of who I am and what I'm interested in, like how many it appeared to be women photographers were in here compared to men. And it's a 2-to-1 ratio in your book, which I've, it's very impressive to have a third of the book as women photographers, given what we know about just access that women have had. But can you speak a little bit to the industry or the art of photography and sort of what roles women have played and what kind of access you've seen them have?
So yeah, I noticed that as well, and I think it reflects a reality. I think there were less women photographers early on, although I'm sure there are others to be discovered. So the first part of my book, as I mentioned earlier, profiles some key pioneering figures who are all men, and actually they were making their work when they were not necessarily even thinking of themselves as Latino or Chicano. But I think they're important historical precedents, and the story really begins with the civil rights movement. So even though again the majority of those photographers are men, one thing that really struck me is that the first is a woman, and she's also somebody who's lesser known. Her name is Maria Varela. She came from Chicago, and she was involved, first of all, in the African American civil rights movement in the South. She went to Alabama. She helped with voter registration drives. And she wrote that, when she arrived in Alabama in the early 1960s, people had no experience with dealing with a Mexican American, and certainly not a Mexican American woman. But she was very involved in voter drive education. And because she needed to create booklets, she started taking pictures. She started making her own photographs. And she was pretty much self taught, but she made really powerful, beautiful pictures in the South, and then eventually relocated to Los Angeles, where she was involved with the Chicano civil rights movement there, and then with the land rights movement in New Mexico, where she still is located. So, again, here we have a pioneering figure who deserves to be better known and is not. I really found that the story in terms of women photographers begins more forcefully in the 1980s. So, this is when you have a rising generation of photographers that include figures like Isabel Castro in Los Angeles, who is doing feminist work, Kathy Vargas in San Antonio, who is making these beautiful kind of altar like assemblages that she was photographing. Delilah Montoya, who was also using a range of kind of stage manipulation, forms of manipulation to photograph her community. And Maria Magdalena Campos, who's doing this extraordinary, ambitious stage photography about her Afro-Cuban identity. So I think that the story begins to change in the 80s and even more. And then we move into the 1990s with a figure like Cristina Fernandez, also in Los Angeles, who creates the series Maria's Great Expedition, which is really an iconic work in the history of photography. And then, the photographer that I already mentioned, Laura Aguilar, who begins to make a series of work, dealing with lesbian identity and her body. So, as I meant, so the situation does change, but we have seen, especially earlier in this history, a history of machismo. When I was realizing in my chapter on LA Chicano, which really starts kind of in the 1970s and goes in the 1980s. And when I first wrote it, there were almost no women photographers. And I, said to myself, wait a minute, what's going on? And I researched and searched. I did finally find a few women like Elsa Flores. But that history of Chicano art in LA in that period, is very machismo. And the same thing happens in New York in the 1970s, like with the founding of Enfoco, a very important organization, but it was founded by by a group of men. Although later in the 1990s, somebody like Perla de Leon comes out of that organization and does some extraordinary street photography in the South Bronx in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And I think now the playing field has leveled quite a bit, but it's taken a long time. I do think that women are coming out of MFA programs. They're making really really good work, and I do think that over time there's going to be more equity. But it took a long time for women photographers to get there.
And what have you seen are have been the barriers to either women or femme photographers being able to engage in photography or have their photography published, have evidence of work they've done, right? Founding always is a symbol to me of like, just because we don't know about it doesn't mean it wasn't made. So what are the barriers to that you found as you were trying to research? It sounds like you had an eye to, wait a minute, there had to be some. Let me go look deeper. What were the barriers that you saw that made them less obvious than some of the other figures or male figures that you found?
Well, I think first of all, there is the barrier of being able to make the work. So, speaking of Fanny, she was probably the most privileged woman in the state of California at that time. I don't think a woman who had lesser means would have been able to pursue photography as she was able to in the 1850s. So, economic means is always a barrier. Fanny gave up photography when she got married. That was a much more conservative time. But there's also, especially when we talk about the 1960s and 70s, women getting married, women having babies, the expectations put on women, which are different today. But that was very true in the 1970s. I found a few women who abandoned their photography, or I think decided that because they were not getting the recognition, they could no longer pursue it. So I found women who had a really great body of work, but maybe only for a decade or so. And then they actually were literally hard to find. And that's simply because of what was going on at the time, that they didn't have a place to exhibit their work, or if they did, they didn't find economic success. There was actually at El Museo del Barrio in New York in the 1980s, the director Susanna Laval founded the F-Stop Gallery there, which was really just a hallway, but it showed many women photographers. And that history, that list of photographers is published. But when I look for those actual photographers, a lot of them didn't continue in the field. And that's regrettable, but they simply didn't get the affirmation, they didn't have the commercial success. And if it was hard enough for Latinx men, you can imagine even harder for Latina women at the time. I think, and now again, it's different. I think women receive positions in academia. There are women who are showing in galleries. There are a lot of grants and residencies and those kinds of opportunities that are much more visible for women. And so the situation has changed. But in researching the history of photography, you're correct in that I really had to dig harder and longer to find that information.
And what would be your advice or call to action to today's Latina photographers, curators, editors, when it comes to being able to have photographers have this kind of exposure, or what comes next?
Well, for young photographers, first of all, I'd say hone your craft, develop your voice, have something to say, be aware of the history of photography, the history that came before you. And it's really hard because you need to say something a little different or in a little different way, but you need to develop your own voice. And then when you're ready, you really need to get out there. It's hard because you want to make your work, you want to spend all your time making your work, but you need to spend time looking for the grants, looking for the residencies, looking for open calls where there's an interesting curator who will be reviewing the work. And I would say from being on the other side of the fence that even though you might not get that grant or residency, people are going to look at your work. If it's a curator who is thoughtful and really trying to help the field, they're going to be taking notes about the photographers that they're interested in. And if you keep applying, you're going to hit, apply for the thing that really makes sense for you at your point in time. And eventually it's going to start happening. And once that first residency or grant is successful, you're going to be able to follow up with more opportunities and kind of open up opportunities for you. It's for me as a curator, it's a lot of looking. One of the things that has changed a lot in my career is social media. I follow so many photographers and publications on Instagram, and so that has opened up a lot of names and ideas to me. I also I'm often a panelist. I'm often on that side of kind of choosing, and I'm just always looking. I try to go to as many shows as I can. Luckily, I'm in New York, so there's a lot of exhibitions to see. But we have the internet, so we can look at galleries and spaces everywhere. And I think another thing that is still a very viable possibility is to create your own spaces, create your own collectives. And if things aren't happening for you, make them happen on your own.
Your book ends with a call to action. So I just want to share that and get your thinking around this quote. It says, for Latinx photographers to receive the serious study and documentation their work deserves will require scholars, curators, critics, gallerists, and collectors. In other words, the art world writ large to broaden their purview. Only then will a more inclusive picture of history of American art, one consistent with our past and present realities, be brought forth. Do you see these shifts in the art world that are leading to more an inclusive history of American art?
Yeah, I think it's beginning. I think that African American artists are getting much more attention than they were, say, a decade or even 5 years ago. I see the same thing with Latinx artists. I think that curators throughout the United States realize that there have been these omissions and that these artists have been making, incredibly powerful work. So when I go to museums in different parts of the United States, I do see more exhibitions and I do see a more inclusive voice. I'm not saying that problem has been solved. I think that we as curators, as Latinx people, need to keep pushing. But I think that there are openings. And I think another thing that's very important is that there are more curators of color that are being hired, including by major museums. For example, a few years ago, the Whitney Museum of Art hired Marcela Guerrero, who was their first Latinx curator. And that makes a sea change, when photographers who come from these communities, who are experts in their own communities, have these large platforms, they begin to make a very large impact in the world of art. So I think that it's something that we should appreciate and we should take advantage of, but we shouldn't think that there's not more to do. There's a lot more to do. There's more books to be written. There's more curators to be hired. Artists need to keep pushing, and I think we just continue to have our voices heard. And I would just add to that while my book is a history of Latinx photography, it's really important for these photographers to be seen as part of American photography. Within those larger histories, Latinx photographers are still excluded. So I hope that when the next mammoth history of American photography is written, or when the next blockbuster exhibition comes out, that we begin to see these photographers take their rightful place within that history, because then the history is accurate and then the history is inclusive.
Yes, that is something we'd all love to see, right? So, as the shift is happening sort of in this echelon of the art world, what have you seen happening in alternative spaces or folks who are using the internet or pop ups or things like that, that also is exciting and shifting how photographers are recognized or how they're showing their work?
Well, a few things. I think one thing that was exciting to me was to see the issue of Aperture dedicated to Latinx art. And then one thing that's wonderful about Aperture as a photography organization is that, especially during this era of pandemic, they've had a number of Zoom panel discussions and programs, just devoted to that one issue. And so, that brought the photographers and ideas in that issue to a national audience. That for me, be validated that the work that I'm doing has had some impact.
I also just want to mention that all the Aperture Zoom webinars are on their YouTube channel. So we'll link to those in the show notes so people can find those as well.
I've also been really excited about the work that the U.S. Latinx Art Forum is doing. They are an organization that has presented a number of programs on Zoom with some of the leading curators and artists. They're also supporting artists with very generous grants. And their programs with artists and curators have been fascinating, high-level discussions, and it's included photographers. So I would point people in that direction as well.
You also highlighted veteranas y rucas who are preserving and sharing a visual history in a more almost democratic way. Can you talk a little bit about what attracted you to what they're doing? And they're not the only ones. There's, I think, New Yorkinos is also doing a similar project, and they're also receiving a lot of recognition in New York. how do you see this aspect of digital culture and collection and curation, and what role does that play in the how we understand photography and the contribution of Latinx creators?
So that's an excellent question, and that opens up a lot of issues because I think one of the core issues has been the lack of access. Gatekeepers who decide who's going to be published, who's going to exhibit. With Instagram and with social media, that has changed. Suddenly, there's this democratic platform that we can all take part in, and of course, Instagram is just filled with thousands and thousands and literally millions of images. When Guadalupe Rosales began Veteranas and Rucas, she created another way of working with Instagram, in that it is a site that she manages, but it is crowdsourced with images that are provided by her followers. People submit photographs of themselves, of people that they went to school with, of members of their family. She started it as a site to document something that she was personally interested in, the Southern California kind of party crew scene of the 1990s. And she saw that as something that was formative to her own identity, but was one of those areas that people didn't know much about unless they were part of it. And she saw the information just kind of disappearing. So she decided to start to document it. And over time, she broadened the site to invite women to simply submit pictures. And what this does is that it validates all of us in terms of being able to preserve the memory of our lives, our loved ones, our experiences. Veteranas and Rucas has something like 274,000 followers.
Wow.
And that's immense. And, I think it's really beautiful the way Guadalupe Rosales states the purpose of the site: reframing our past by sharing our stories for better futures.
That's beautiful.
And so for me, this idea that um, these platforms for the dissemination of the image, for the dissemination of our history, are now more widely available is really important. It's valuable. And it's very moving to go through the images and look at the photos that people submit. And as you mentioned, there's another one, Nueva Yorkinos, which was founded by a woman in New York, and it's dedicated to preserving the memory of the Puerto Rican family in New York. So this is obviously something that is important to people, and I'm really encouraged by the possibility of using a site like Instagram for this kind of purpose.
Yeah, I love that. My all my grandparents moved from Puerto Rico to New York, so when I look through her site, I always see similarities in pictures that I saw growing up. Of they were. I think hers focuses more on the Bronx. My family grew up in Brooklyn, but it always is so feels so connecting to see those images and say, "Oh, I have a
Exactly.
picture like that. I
Same
have
with
one
me
that
and
looks like
Veteranas
that."
and Rucas.
So on each of the coasts, there's this preservation of culture that is really beautiful and is such a new way of giving access, which, as you said earlier, that the early creators of work or access to creating work wasn't present. And now that's just increasing more and more.
And but one thing that I would add about that is that when I was interviewing, especially the older photographers who really didn't have the kind of MFA type of education that the contemporary photographers had, time and again they said, the first time I looked at photographs was my father's album when he was in the military, or the photographs that my grandmother would keep in a shoebox. So family photographs really have a very strong resonance in the kinds of motivations that photographers have to pursue this profession. And that that idea of family, which is so connected to idea of la cultura, it all becomes fodder for the kind of work that our photographers end up creating.
I think having those images of our history, as I've thought about my own family in Puerto Rico, it's sort of like there's a couple of generations maybe where you're like now we have tons of photographs, less and less, and then there's maybe like one photograph a few
Hmm.
generations back. And having to look at more generalized, I've gone through archive.org or the Library of Congress and looked at pictures of Puerto Rico from the past, but they're often not taken by Puerto Ricans. They're often taken by Americans who've come, usually American men who've come,
Exactly.
or white Americans, I mean, we're also Americans, the gaze is just different. The purpose is different. And being able to have that immediate sense of connection and familiarity.
Exactly.
And that's something I think that your book also does, is places so beautifully the cultural and social context, political context of some of these photographers and why they were significant or what role they played in that particular point of history. I think was also really informative, and I loved having either reflected in my own experience and knowledge or for other groups that I did not have as much experience or knowledge, and really being able to have that context was really helpful. So thank you for
Thank you.
that. What would you say for younger youths, right, who are out there now, who are thinking of going into art history, curation? What is advice or thoughts you would give to them about how to enter the field or things to think about now?
Well, that's a hard question because I think it's often difficult to enter the field of curating. It can be very competitive to get that first position. And I think these days there's the expectation that you begin by being an intern, which is often an unpaid position, and then after you have your internship, you're expected to have another internship. So it can be a difficult route, but if it's something that you're committed to doing, I'm a curator and a writer, and I love both equally. But there's something to me about creating an exhibition that feels very physical and tangible. You're going to be able to share the work with whoever comes through the door, and these days whoever looks on the internet. So I feel like there's a lot to be said about the kind of access that can be created through curating. Again, it's a matter of finding those jobs, finding those opportunities. It may not always be a full-time position. It may be a freelance opportunity to curate a show in a more improvised space. But if you're young and you're starting out, you should take advantage of those opportunities. Part of it is getting to know the art community in your neighborhood. Knowing the artists, knowing the photographers, thinking about what kind of work you gravitate to, and think about interesting ways to present the work. Work closely with the photographers. As a curator, you're helping to provide a voice for artists, so you need to work closely with them and really understand what their goals are, and then you provide the means for them to be able to do so. So it's not simply about selecting work and figuring out how many will fit on a wall. It's about trying to tell a story, trying to present the work in a certain way, creating texts that amplify the meaning of the work. Be willing to be there on site, meet with people, talk to people, create occasions for dialogue. So I feel like it's one of the most dynamic and pleasurable ways to be involved in the art world. But it's a lot of work. It involves a lot of knowledge, a lot of dedication, and the ability to kind of put yourself out there to try to find those opportunities until you get the full-time job, and then you have a regular platform to present exhibitions.
And you've definitely shown you have a very broad base of knowledge, not only of photographers, but with all the shows that you've curated. So thank you for sharing your own knowledge. Is there and this is a tough question, but is there an image that you've seen that has kind of stuck with you that is significant or that you has really left a mark for you?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. There is a image in the history of Latinx photography that I think is a difficult image, but something that for me is just so memorable. It is by Laura Aguilar. It's called Three Eagles Flying, and it's from 1990. It's a black and white photograph of Laura, who's nude, except that her face is covered with the flag of Mexico, and her torso is covered with the flag of the United States. And she's bound by ropes. The ropes go around her neck and then around her crossed hands, and her breasts are bare. On either side of her is the American flag and the Mexican flag. So here she's, talking about her identity as a Mexican American. She's talking about the conflicting influences that have driven her identity. And she's also talking about these nationalistic forms of identity as being kind of a form of imprisonment, an impediment. And she's also presenting her body very frankly, in that we see her large body, her large breasts. It's such a forthright and direct image, and it expresses to me an artist that's willing to take risks, in a very extreme way to make a statement. And so I just think that this is the kind of powerful image that an artist that has a lot to say can make. Again, it may be difficult to look at, but it just pulls a punch. And I just find it one of the most memorable works in the entire corpus of Latinx photography.
And what does it bring up for you personally? What is your connection to the image?
Well, I'm Mexican American, and honestly, I don't feel that kind of conflict as strongly as Laura did. You know, I feel like um, I feel like I believe that that my Mexican identity has been something that I've been able to richly draw from, and that I'm very proud of. At the same time, I was born in the United States. My parents were born in the United States, so I'm very much an American as well, and I accept that. For better or for worse these days. But I think that we do wrestle with our identity, and Laura was able to key in on it in just this very both intimate and powerful way.
And what is next for you? What projects are you working on?
Well, I've been really excited by a project that I've been working on for about a year. I was invited by the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona to curate a retrospective exhibition of Luis Carlos Bernal. He was a photographer who was born in Tucson and was primarily active from the early 1970s to the late 1980s. He had a tragic bike accident in 1989 and then died in 1993. So, in that period in the 1970s and 80s, he spent a lot of time working in the barrios, both in Tucson and in other parts of the Southwest, photographing Mexican American people in their homes, either inside the home or in their gardens. And he creates the sense of the worlds that these people lived in a very intimate way, very kind of honest way of depicting people that really had not been seen in this way before. Some of the photographs are in color, others are in black and white. I think that he was probably the first Chicano photographer to see his work as an artist. He came out of the tradition of the journalist photographer, the photographers of the civil rights movement who were making documents and who were covering news events. He wanted to create works that, in one sense, were documentary, but were also very, very intentional as artworks. And so they're very beautiful. They're very beautifully composed and lit. He's well known among Chicano photographers and especially in Arizona. But this will be a nationally touring exhibition, and I think it will provide a strong groundwork for seeing Bernal also as a important American photographer of that era.
That sounds fabulous. We'll get the information from you and also make sure to link that in our show notes.
Thank you.
You've told us about lots of different photographers that you would like us to look at. Are there any that you want to, in our last few minutes together, really give an extra shout out to or say it's important to really know about these certain photographers, either up and coming or established?
Well, one photographer that I have such a great deal of respect for is Delilah Montoya, who has been around for a good while now, at least since the early 1990s. And she's worked with a lot of different formats of photography, some straight photography. She did a really strong series on women boxers, but often using stage photography or forms of manipulation. She's worked with collage. She made a large series uh, the on men who have the tattoo of the Virgin of Guadalupe on their backs. She's created installations and manipulated works based on those images. Most recently, she's worked on a series called Contemporary Casta Portraiture. So castas were the kind of hierarchy that the Spaniards imposed in the New World in Mexico, beginning in the 1500s, to demonstrate the superiority of their white blood. And so, at the top of the casta hierarchy were pure Spaniards, and then below that was a Spaniard who had married with an indigenous person, and then on until people that were purely indigenous, who they would term in very denigrating word with very denigrating words.
And if folks haven't seen Costa paintings, it's very informative to see. It's actually a visual representation of these
Exactly.
systems. I think is really important for us to understand that history.
Yes, so Delilah has created these contemporary Costa portraits, which aren't really portraits in that way. They're really portraits of contemporary families. But she's updated this whole idea by studying the DNA of one of the persons in her photograph. So it'll be a family scene, and perhaps the husband or the wife has their DNA in a little vial in the corner of the image, as well as information about the fact that, as Latinx people, we also have African blood, Middle Eastern blood, Asian blood. So it's a really fascinating look at really what it, in a very kind of scientific sense, what it means to be a Latinx person today, because we're all of very mixed ancestry. So that is one photographer who's very interesting to me, and the way that she looks at our communities kind of from a social point of view. And then somebody who is very different is a Cuban American, Maria Martinez Gañas, who's based in Miami. She was born in 1960. From the time that she was a student, she was always interested in the technology behind photography and the different forms of printing and creating images. So very early on, she was cutting up her negatives or using this material called ruby lith to mask parts of her images. And she has created this really exceptional body of work, almost exclusively with different forms of photographic manipulation to create works about her identity as a Cuban. In one series of works, she worked with Cuban stamps. In another series, she created works that were an homage to Alfredo Lam, who's an important pioneering modernist painter. She's made botanical images. And more recently, she's made these constructions that rely on photography, but that are also sculptural. And so for me, she represents a photographer who has had a very long career and who keeps evolving and who brings in other media into photography, which is more and more common these days. Karen Miranda Rivadeneira, who I mentioned earlier, is now bringing musical instruments and video into the work. Martin Gutierrez, who is somebody who we haven't talked about much, has worked on magazines with billboards, with video and performance. So for me, that points to the way that photography continues to evolve and to encompass new realms, new formats.
So exciting to see the evolution of their work. Thank you for sharing those artists with us. And how can people find you, engage with you, or follow your work and buy your book?
Thank you. So you can find me at elizabethferrer.net. That's my website. I'm on social media. I'm mostly active on Instagram. So I'm EV Ferrer on Instagram. And in terms of finding the book, it's certainly on Amazon, but I think that your website also has a link to purchase it. So I would want to support your site for that.
Thank you so much for that. So we do have a bookshop storefront that does have a small contribution that when you buy Elizabeth's book through our link, then we do get a small portion of that to support the work of Our Latina Lens. Elizabeth, thank you so much. It is such an honor to speak with you. Thank you for this incredible work and for laying a foundation for everything that's to come, either through you and your research or others who pick up and their curiosity is piqued and they continue from this amazing foundation you've laid for us.
Thank you again.
Could you help us out by sharing this episode with your friends and family? Another way to help is to rate and review this podcast on Apple and Spotify. It really does help out. Gracias.